From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. After so much expectation and conspiracy and political argument, this week all the questions about Jeffrey Epstein and his demise were to be put to bed. The FBI had been through hard drives, through locked desks, paperwork, properties. But when they presented their report, it seems like they didn't find much. No evidence of bribery, no secret client list of the rich and powerful, they say. But a Times investigation, only last week, into one of Epstein's most prominent victims, suggests this might not be the full picture.
We have the Trump administration coming into power and talking constantly about transparency on this case, and then here was the woman in the centre of it who just wasn't speaking. And so when this post came out, I kind of reached back out to her representative and I said, you know, I would love to speak to Virginia.
The story today: what Virginia Giuffre's diary tells us about the Epstein files. Let us get cracking. So, Josie, can we start? Both your names, who you are, where you are as well.
I'm Josie Ensor. I'm the US correspondent based in New York for The Times and Sunday Times, and I've been covering Jeffrey Epstein in one way or another for about 5 years.
And throughout that 5 years, there has been no end of fascination about what he got up to, how the authorities dealt with him, how he died in custody. And on Monday, we had this FBI investigation conclude and report. It's been going on for ages. What did they find? What stuck out for you?
Yeah, so it came as a surprise to a lot of us, particularly those who cover Jeffrey Epstein. But President Trump's Justice Department and the FBI concluded that there was basically no evidence that Epstein blackmailed powerful figures, or that he kept a client list, or that he was murdered in some way as speculated. The administration also released a video that it said indicated that no one entered the area of the Manhattan prison where Epstein was held the night he died suspiciously in 2019. Though again, mysteriously, there was a minute missing from that footage.
Which just, I guess, further fueled speculation.
Yes, and I think it really put a dampener on all of these expectations that we had. I mean, we have the DOJ and the FBI saying in this memo that there will be no further disclosure of Epstein-related material and that wouldn't be appropriate or warranted.
So all these people who for ages have said there's something fishy about this, people have been online discussing it, had he blackmailed people in the past with incriminating evidence, essentially this report has boiled down to nothing to see here.
Yes, which Trump basically said himself on Tuesday.
But separate to this, Josie, only a week or so ago, you had an exclusive investigation into one of his most prominent victims, Virginia Giuffre. What did you find in that?
Yeah, so Virginia Giuffre is probably the most vocal, or was the most vocal and well-known and prominent advocate that spoke out against Jeffrey Epstein. Not only that, she also accused a number of high-profile, influential people that Epstein was associated with. So we know for a fact that she sued Prince Andrew in courts in the US, and she won that settlement, although Prince Andrew denied all the allegations. So she really is at the centre of all of this. So to tell the backstory of it, what happened is Virginia, she hasn't done interviews for years. I mean, she has kept very, very quiet, particularly after the Duke settlement. Part of the clause of the settlement is that she wasn't going to kind of repeat these allegations over and over again. So she really wasn't in the media. I mean, she lived in this very remote part of Australia in Perth, and was pretty reclusive. So when she posted this message on Instagram, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners will remember, because it was so cryptic, so it was on March the 30th this year, and she posted a picture of herself apparently bruised and bloodied after a car accident near her home in Perth. And she said she had 4 days to live, and there were sort of more questions and answers about this. And as someone who's covered the Epstein case in one way or another since 2020, when I arrived in New York, I have come to know a lot of the victims quite intimately. And so when Virginia posted this, I thought there's something to this. And it doesn't seem like the media is covering it. After the Instagram post, I really just wanted to speak to Virginia. I mean, this is someone we hadn't heard from for a long time. A lot had happened since then. In the background, we have the Trump administration coming into power and talking constantly about transparency on this case. And then here was the woman in the center of it who just wasn't speaking. And so when this post came out, I kind of reached back out to her representative and I said, I would love to speak to Virginia. I would love to find out what's happening in her life. Clearly, she's going through a lot. Talk more about the post that she made in March, and her PR said, do you know what, she's really not in a good way physically or mentally, but I'll see what I can do. She said, how would you like to speak to her? And I said, honestly, any way that she's capable. So I kind of drafted an extensive list of 25 questions to let her mull over them and maybe consider it. I went on holiday briefly for about 10 days, and then on the final Friday of my holiday, Deanie, the PR, calls me and she says, I'm really sorry to tell you, Virginia took her life. And it was at that point, we took a minute, we took a beat. I carried on talking to the PR and I said a couple of days later, I'm sorry if this is really insensitive, but I would still really love to tell Virginia's story and what the final months and years of her life were like. And the PR said, let me speak to the family, we'll see what we want to do and figure things out. I didn't hear anything for 2 months, and then she got back in touch with a phone call last month and said, the family want to do it and we want to do it with you. I think I'd kind of built up a bit of a relationship with Deanie, the PR, and there has to be a certain level of trust on stories like this, and you have to work very, very closely, with families and with survivors, because I think these stories are so, so, so sensitive, and I don't approach it in the way that I do other stories, and it's much more kind of collaborative, because obviously part of the story you're telling is the families, and you don't want them to be totally unhappy with the final product, and you want to kind of do a good job in part of memorializing her life, and it's a kind of an important responsibility. So, we spent some time getting to know each other. Deanie said, look, I'll introduce you. So we had a 2-hour off the record, which means that, I couldn't report anything from that phone call. But we talked over Zoom. Sky, her brother, is based in Colorado, and Danny, her other half-brother, is based in Texas. So we did very, very early in the morning before work.
And this was a matter of weeks after she'd passed away, Virginia.
Yeah,
so everything must have been quite raw still.
Very, very, very raw. I mean, we talked later about how it was basically a 2-hour therapy session. I mean, there was a lot of tears. So we had this 2-hour therapy session, and I said, unfortunately, we're going to have to do this again at some point on the record. But in the meantime, they said, we've got a lot of stuff that we want to share, that I think Virginia wanted to share. So there was photos, there was a journal that she was keeping. A lot of it was undated, but we know that much of what was shared with me anyway was taken from or written between January and her death in April. And it was just sort of fascinating to be reading through this diary and to getting an insight into her life and see it in her own writing, in her own expression. There's a real kind of stream of consciousness thought to it, but there's also just a real clarity of thought, I think. And that's always something that her PR and her lawyers have said about her, is, the media likes to talk about inconsistencies in her story, but actually she was always, pretty consistent on the story that she told about Prince Andrew and others that were on Epstein's island and accusations she made against Epstein. And she always had a kind of clarity of thought when it came to that. So it was very, very fascinating reading through her diary, for sure. So we tried to build up a picture of her life from that.
And a picture of her life, especially towards the end, but also within all of that information was insight into Jeffrey Epstein, to go back to where we started, and what her experience of him was. What stood out for you from that?
Yeah, so there was part of it that wasn't the focus of our story, so it kind of almost got buried, and then I revisited it when all this Epstein stuff came back around with the DOJ announcements. In one passage, to read it, she says, I used to be watched by Epstein's hidden cameras, which I've seen myself. The FBI has the archive footage showing me being abused by other men used as blackmail. And intriguingly, there were other comments that we actually didn't get into in our reporting, mentioning several high-profile people, including the level of prime minister in another country, that, essentially what I would say is this isn't the end of our reporting.
Okay, but what is clear at this point, to skim over that tease, is that directly contradicts what the FBI and DOJ were saying this week, does it not? She's saying, there were these things which were used to blackmail me, and I think there's this information out there which might blackmail other people. And the DOJ and FBI were saying that kind of stuff doesn't exist. Move on.
Yes. So, specifically, the government said there was no credible evidence found that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. We did not uncover evidence that could predicate any investigation against uncharged third parties, which essentially means he didn't have accomplices. There weren't other people out there that were helping or aiding him or, taking part in this abuse. What we do know from both my own reporting and from speaking to victims and from, public reporting that's out there is at least one other victim, including the Briton Sarah Ransom, has claimed to me and publicly that Epstein secretly filmed sexual encounters between his victims and high-profile figures to be used later as blackmail. And for those of us reporters that have been looking at it, so, not just myself, but people who've been doing it for much longer. So if you look at Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald, because, she broke the investigation because a lot of what was happening in South Florida and Palm Beach.
The original investigation into Epstein when he was alive.
Yes, yes. And he served a very brief sentence in Florida. These aren't the mad conspiracy theorists, and they're saying there is a cover-up using those exact words. You have questions being asked as to what was recovered from these FBI raids of Epstein's various homes following his arrest in 2019. We know from reports that there were these large black binders holding labelled CDs and hard drives discovered particularly in this 8-story Upper East Side apartment in Manhattan. And so there's a lot of stuff we know for fact that was found at these properties, but there has never been any kind of public disclosure of what those are.
So people have been worried for ages that there's been a cover-up about Jeffrey Epstein, and Donald Trump has been the knight in shining armour saying, I'm going to throw open the safes and make all of this transparent. There's a risk now that people think that Donald Trump is part of a cover-up.
I think why this report was so jolting is that you have Trump and his administration promising this kind of radical transparency, not just for the public, but for his victims too. And you get the impression that they want this to now just go away, but it's kind of unlikely that this is going to be the final chapter.
Josie, we've been discussing the Epstein files, this report that was released by the US government earlier this week, and the expectation and rumour has abounded. It's sort of raised more questions, I guess, than it's answered. But as you were alluding to a moment ago, this is particularly personal for Trump, isn't it? He knew Epstein. He denies he did or saw anything untoward with him, but he is involved.
Yes. At a very factual level, we have Donald Trump, years before he was president, appearing on travel records for Epstein's private jet, which was nicknamed the Lolita Express. So we have him traveling on there a couple of times. Their friendship dates back to the late 80s when the pair were both moving in New York's high society and spending time together in Palm Beach, where they both had homes. We see them going to Victoria's Secret angel shows together. He tells New York Magazine of Epstein, I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy, fun to be around. He likes beautiful women as much as I do. And, there's been various reporting over the years by Michael Wolff, who's kind of Trump's unofficial biographer, who released tapes conducted with Epstein about their friendship. And he seemed to know quite a lot about his life during that time. And to go back to Virginia, she was recruited by Epstein's sort of right-hand woman, Ghislaine Maxwell, from Mar-a-Lago, which is Trump's Florida resort. So while Trump had nothing to do with that moment or that recruiting, we know that, Mar-a-Lago is kind of at the center of Virginia's story. So what's interesting is Elon Musk first dropped this idea during the middle of a row. It was kind of this explosive bomb that, these files aren't being released because Trump is mentioned in it. What I would say, not to kill a story, but I've done a lot of reporting in there, speaking to both Virginia's representative and her family and other Epstein victims like Courtney Wild. And, what they say is that they had this falling out over this property deal in Florida. in the mid-90s, and Trump was furious that they were both trying to bid for the same property, this kind of really lucrative acreage on the water. And they had a massive falling out, and Trump, in particularly Trumpian style, just never spoke to Epstein again. And what we do actually know from my reporting is that Trump was actually very, very helpful in the lawyers' investigation into Epstein. So he kind of turned on Epstein, and he was telling the victims' lawyers, like Virginia's lawyers, anything you need. I will tell you anything you need about Epstein. And while, they were getting totally stonewalled by other similarly high-profile people, Trump was actually actively working behind the scenes to get Epstein, either civilly or criminally indicted.
And that sort of makes sense when you think about how the Trump administration first approached this idea of the Epstein files and what to do about them. They seem, correct me if I'm wrong, very open. Yeah, we've got these things, we're going to release them soon.
Yeah, so they made this huge big show of saying, that we are a different administration. The previous Democrat-led administration was hiding this, was shielding it from you. It was all part of a kind of wider conspiracy. So they really kind of went gangbusters in saying, we're going to crack this wide open.
Would you declassify the 9/11 files?
Yeah.
Would you declassify JFK files?
Yeah. I did a lot of it.
Would you declassify the Epstein files?
Yeah, I would.
All right.
I guess I would. I think that less so because, you don't know it. You don't want to affect people's lives if it's phony stuff in there, because there's a lot of phony stuff with that whole world. But I think I would.
And then how has that slowly panned out, actually, in office as the months have rolled on?
So, as I said, there's been this perception that this information's been held by the courts, by the politicians, by the media, and they're going to finally kind of put everything out in the open. You had Trump on the campaign trail saying that he had no problem in releasing the Epstein files, suggesting he wasn't concerned what was going to be in them. Another figure in all this is the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who has consistently said it's sitting on my desk to review. We're going to be releasing this.
The DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that.
In February, she talked about this kind of bombshell new evidence she was going to have and release about Epstein's connection to powerful people. So she's one of the players in all this, has been really pushing for it. What's intriguing about Bondi is she was actually the Attorney General in Florida in the years between when Epstein served his only sentence for sex trafficking in the state, and he was later arrested by the FBI. So, at the side of all of this is her saying, there was a massive cover-up for all these years. And it's like, well, okay, well, you were the Attorney General in Florida during some of the key years of this abuse. So, and on the FBI side of things, you have Kash Patel, who's now the FBI director, and his deputy, Dan Bongino. And again, what's intriguing about these people is that they, for years, actually peddled in these conspiracy theories that Epstein didn't kill himself, which they said on their podcasts, and promised to get to the bottom of it. Bongino himself claimed last year that Epstein was a serial blackmailer.
Nobody knows how much material people have on Jeffrey Epstein. It's unbelievable. The guy killed himself, and now nobody's going to know.
So in terms of what has actually been released, so you had in February this very, very bizarre stunt that involved binders and far-right conspiracy theorists.
What you're going to see, hopefully tomorrow, is a lot of flight logs, a lot of names, a lot of information.
I have a very visual image in my head of them walking out of the White House holding these white binders saying Epstein files. I mean, it was a kind of made-for-TV moment, and a lot of us sort of groaned because we thought, okay, well, if you're promising all this kind of radical transparency, why are you releasing it first off to just a select group of people who aren't accountable, who aren't, mainstream media?
Who aren't journalists?
Not that there's a problem with that, but I mean, if you're talking about, releasing things to the public, then release things to the public.
Yeah.
And they're sort of trailing all this saying, wow, you wouldn't believe what's in it. And then late into the night, the DOJ on its own official website released tranches of this information. I was going through it thinking, what is new? I mean, a lot of this is publicly accessible stuff. We're talking about flight logs. We're talking about address books, the so-called black contacts book. And I'm just going through it with my editor, and he's like, what's new? What can we say? And I was like, there's nothing here that we didn't know. I remember Virginia at the time, she did put a message on X saying she was a bit disappointed that hadn't come out, but she was still hopeful that, there would be justice for the victims and that there would be more to come out and more to follow.
So we've had one release of information early on in the year, which seemed like a bit of a damp squib, not much in there. We've then had this report, which has had access to everything behind closed doors, which has now said, nothing to see here. Actually, it's all pretty much legit and there's no cover-up and he wasn't murdered. Do you think that the people who have had an about face on this, people like the now FBI director, someone who, as you say, has gone from saying there's been a cover-up to saying, well, no, there's nothing to see here. Do you think this is conspiracist colliding with just the facts and then having to look at it all and go, oh, yeah, I was wrong?
I think the problem here is that these figures in the administration, like Patel, like Bongino, have led this quite frenzied pursuit of finding the truth in this case. And in doing so, they've kind of harnessed the most obsessive parts of the MAGA base and whipped them up into this frenzy, only to go around and tell them, oh, it's nothing, move on. So we have this reporter a day after this memo is released asking Trump in a cabinet meeting about why the investigation was closed. And Trump becomes incredibly irritated.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. You're asking... We have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable. It just seems like a desecration, but you go ahead.
But for the Epstein obsessives, which make up a small but kind of influential cohort of Trump's far-right MAGA coalition, have zero inclination to move on.
As in sort of, they've been marched up the hill and now the sort of leaders in these conspiracy theories have said nothing to see here. I mean, how has that gone down with your online MAGA types?
Oh, very, very poorly. So you have people like Lara Loomer, who's sort of the far-right Trump whisperer, who has obviously no official role in the administration, but seems to be consistently giving Trump advice on who to fire and who not to, has said, the American people and MAGA base will not tolerate being lied to. And then you have, the former Fox News host, Tucker Carlson, claiming Bondi is covering up some very serious crimes.
They're covering up, the DOJ, the current DOJ under Pam Bondi is covering up crimes. Very serious crimes by their own description.
You have Alex Jones, who's kind of the grandfather of conspiracy theorists with his former website InfoWars, calling the DOJ memo over the top sickening.
So now by coming in and being part of the cover-up, the Trump administration has become part of it. I'm going to go throw up, actually. And this only happens every few years when something really, really bad happens or something. I mean, I'm physically going to puke probably right now.
And what's kind of interesting is you even have the January 6th insurrectionists that were pardoned by Trump putting meme-worthy videos online saying they're disappointed and basically just a suggestion that they no longer trust these people.
But Josie, I don't want to say you are a Laura Loomer or an Alex Jones type yourself, but at the beginning of this episode, we were talking about what you found in your reporting about Virginia Giuffre and how that seemed to cast doubt or contradict what the understanding of this FBI report is. So how do you square that circle?
So in all my reporting over the years, I've kind of really tried to tune out those Epstein conspiracy theorists and really listen to the people who were first-hand witnesses to some of this Epstein abuse. So, we're thinking about some of the British victims. We're thinking in particular of Virginia Giuffre. She, in many ways, is the most reliable person in all of this. She has won 5 lawsuits against people she sued who are related to Epstein and Epstein's estate. So what I really tried to do with this diary is really look at the kind of the first-hand account of this. And so really having it in her own words, in her own writing, really focused that for me. And, it helped me just kind of tune out everything else that everyone was saying and just, relying on what she is saying of her own account of what happened to her.
So is your point then at the end of all of that this FBI report might not be complete nonsense or some cover-up, as some of these fringe figures are saying, but it is clear there might still be questions that need asking?
I think it is a cover-up. I would go so far as to kind of agree with some of the other journalists that have been covering this, that it very much is not just a distraction, but a kind of a hiding of what the FBI did as part of its investigation. I mean, some of it's incredibly sensitive and they would have to redact out possibly victims' names, possibly some other identifying information. But there is definitely not a full level of transparency here when it comes to what the FBI did as part of his investigation.
So finally then, if this sounds like it's going to continue on, the debate and the confusion around all of this is going to continue to dog Donald Trump, isn't it? The questions about Epstein and what's in these files.
I mean, we talked earlier about the kind of impromptu press conference he gave about this and the reporter asking him the question, and his very clear frustration with that Epstein question was a sign that he's obviously very haunted by his connection and these old images of him with Epstein. And these images in people's mind aren't just going to go away. And the big problem for him and his administration is that they've made this huge deal and this huge issue around transparency, and now they just look hypocritical.
Josie Ensor, US correspondent for The Times. You can read so much more of Josie's reporting on Jeffrey Epstein and beyond over at thetimes.com if you have a subscription. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Anna Dowell. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Sato. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.